Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so excited. I am so excited. I am so excited to welcome you back for another phenomenal theological discussion that's invigorating, educational, exciting, and thought-provoking. And so I'm excited that you took time out of your busy, hectic schedule to hang out with us, to spend some time with myself and Pastor John Jackson. We've been having a blast talking about the story of Emmett Till and trauma. That has been our topic focus the last few weeks during our time together on Tuesdays at 12 noon. And we've been examining this story from the various ways in which traumas have taken place in this story. When we first met, we talked about trauma as it exists with Emmett Till unfortunately experiencing the death of his father at a young age, and how this created Asus, adverse childhood experiences, and the trauma of this death of his father. We talked about how Asus is defined as adverse childhood experiences that occur in household dysfunction, abuse, and neglect. And then we also highlighted and talked about the period of 1940s and 50s and 60s in the Woodlawn community of Chicago, Illinois, this neighborhood where Emmett resided here in Chicago with his mother, maybe Till Mobley. And we talked about how Asus also is not just trauma that happens in the household, but Asus is also trauma that happens in the community, as well as trauma that happens in the household. We talked about what's commonly known as the three realms of Asus, which is that which happens in the household, number one, that which happens in the community, number two, such as poverty, racism, substandard housing, unemployment, homelessness, poor schools that are not adequately funded by the local and state governments. And number three, we talked about the Asus of environment. And we talked about how various climate crises and natural disasters, such as COVID-19, also will have a traumatic impact on persons today. We also highlighted the importance of thinking about the trauma of what's also known as the bystander effect. We talked about how when persons witness trauma and don't get involved, don't do anything about it, this also can create another type of trauma that the victims experience. So we talked about the ways in which specifically our young brother, Emmett Till, experienced trauma being in this southern town of Money, Mississippi, and having this interaction with Carolyn Bryant and cousins and other young men in the community who were nearby to witness this interaction, that were nearby to make a wager or a gamble or a bet with young Emmett Till that he would not approach Carolyn Bryant. This also causes trauma. And so we talked about the importance of bystander intervention, getting involved, not making assumptions about who you believe the victim could be. Just simply get involved and do some investigating. That becomes so very important. And we talked about the 5 Ds for bystander intervention. So feel free to check that out, the 5 Ds of bystander intervention. Check out our wonderful time together on last Tuesday for more information about the 5 Ds of bystander intervention. So now, today, we're going to actually now talk about the trauma of being kidnapped. The trauma of being kidnapped. Did you know our brother Emmett Till suffered much trauma from being kidnapped? Let's talk specifics. We have been following the particular special on ABC, Women of the Movement. It is currently streaming on Hulu. And we've been following this series. And so we invite you to check out this series for a visual of this unfortunate, horrific, trauma-inducing event that our young brother Emmett Till suffered. We want to highlight during our time together today, there is trauma in being kidnapped. There is trauma in being kidnapped. 3 questions we'd like for you to reflect on, and we're going to delve into today. Can you think of a biblical character who was kidnapped? Can you think of a biblical character who was kidnapped? Put a thumbprint right there. We're going to come back to that a little bit later in our time together. Number 2, can you think of a particular group of people who were kidnapped? Can you think of a particular group of people who were kidnapped? Put a little thumbprint right there as well. And we're going to come back to that a little later on. First and foremost, it's important to talk about there is trauma in kidnapping. If you remember the details of our young brother Emmett Till, he was sleeping at his uncle's home. And in the middle of the night, he is awoken. In the middle of the night, he is awoke because an angry mob has come to the home of his uncle and other relatives where he is currently residing temporarily while he's visiting from Chicago to Mississippi. And we first and foremost say that dynamic, first and foremost, institutes trauma. What do I mean by that? The act of one being awoke from their sleep or awoken from their sleep and violence now inflicted on them, we say is an act of trauma-inducing processes. Let me give you an example. Have you ever been asleep in good sound REM sleep, and all of a sudden you hear something at your door or you hear a noise in your home and you're startled and you suddenly awake? We say the act of being startled and awakened actually causes what we say is a cognitive impairment in your mind. Most people don't know or don't understand. This is why when you're startled in the middle of sleeping, your mind feels a bit foggy, feels a bit woozy, because that is actual cells in your brain now that have been traumatized through this act of being startled. And so we often have to highlight the ways in which mob violence in this country, specifically based in racism, that was intentional that it would occur at night. All of that was intentional for that to occur at night while one was sleeping, because perpetrators of violence believed that if you've committed violence at night, it has a more long-lasting impact on persons. So, for example, the Ku Klux Klan in this country during the period of Jim Crow from 1865 to the 1950s and early 60s, oftentimes would conduct lynchings of Black folks in the middle of the night. They would arrive at someone's home in the middle of the night and oftentimes kidnap them from the home as a way of creating traumatic terror, not only in the victim's mind, but in the minds of family who were in the home as well. The second piece around this is the actual act of removing young Emmett from his bed where he slept and slumbered and removing him from his home is also a very traumatic incident. I'm going to get ready to share my screen, and I'd like for you to quickly go grab pen and paper. You definitely won't want to miss this. You won't want to miss this. We say this act of kidnapping now creates a traumatic bond between perpetrator and victim. A traumatic bond. Kidnapping, or captivity, as it is described in Judith Herman's Trauma and Recovery book, published in 1992, suggests that a traumatic bond occurs that brings the victim into a prolonged contact with the perpetrator and creates a special type of relationship based on coercive control. The goal of the perpetrator is to instill in his victim not only fear of death, but also gratitude for being allowed to live. Many accounts of persons who were nearby to witness the unfortunate kidnapping and subsequent lynching of Emmett Till would later tell stories of how they heard him begging for his life, begging for his life in some sense, and also in some sense expressing gratitude, thinking or believing that the angry white mob would not kill him, but would simply whip him and then return him home to his uncle's house. This speaks to the goal of the perpetrator is to instill in his victim not only fear of death, but also gratitude for being allowed to live. Last but not least, this traumatic bond creates an attachment between the hostage and the victim or captor. Whereas now they are forever bonded in an unfortunate feeling of being indebted to one another. This feeling of attachment suggests that the hostage and the captor are forever bonded together in some sense. Some of this third point you see speaks to the notion of, as I've heard one scholar say, forever Emmett Till is bonded to this horrific crime. His identity is now attached to his lynching. When you think about the life of Emmett Till, you can't talk about his life without also at some point highlighting his lynching. And experts, psychologists in particular, say that's the sadness with captivity or kidnapping. This traumatic bond that occurs now, in some sense, redefines the identity of the victim, so that we don't just see this victim for who they were. Before the incident of violence occurred, we primarily see their identity as surrounded by or wrapped around the action of violence. I'll pause there for a moment if anybody has any questions.
To your questions about biblical character, kidnapped, particular group of people being kidnapped. Kathleen pointed out Joseph was kidnapped. And Mike points out that Daniel and the Hebrew boys and the Israelite people were kidnapped by Babylon. And then Mike points out that Africans were kidnapped and brought here.
You're doing great, Mike. You're doing great. Thank you, everybody. Yes, everything that everybody named, you hit the nail on the head. Yes. And so oftentimes we say that we cannot look at kidnappings as some frivolous, minute act. In kidnappings, there are a few dynamics that occur. And it's so important to highlight these dynamics. We say that there are 8 dynamics that occur through the act of kidnapping someone. There are 8 dynamics that occur through the act of kidnapping someone. According to Amnesty International, there are 8 dynamics that occur through the act of kidnapping someone or holding someone captive. Number 1, isolation. Victim is deprived of all social support, of their ability to resist. They then develop an intense concern with their self. This could be home environment, makes victim dependent. And so I'm going to tell 2 or 3 stories at one time as we talk about our brother Emmett Till. This act of isolation, in some sense, we say, now challenges person's identity. This act of being kidnapped creates, this act of being kidnapped instills isolation that then drives home a point of, you are no longer you. You are no longer you. Your name is no longer Kunta Kinte. In some sense, when we've often wondered why people of African descent who are now living in this country struggle with their identity, oftentimes we say it is because of African enslavement and the act of being kidnapped and brought from the shores of Africa to this country and being isolated from our motherland that has now created in many African people an inability to understand their identity. Hence why Naeem Akbar would have to pen a book entitled Know Thyself years later. And so I feel for our little brother Emmett Till, who experiences this kidnapping, because this act of isolation most certainly caused him to question his identity. We also say the act of being kidnapped or held captive against your will creates monopolization of perception, where the victim fixes their attention upon their immediate predicament, eliminates information not in compliance with demands, and is punished for independence or resistance. There should be some points that jump out in your mind when I talk about this monopolization of perception. A point that should jump out in your mind is how we understand hope. Oftentimes, being kidnapped, brought to another country, in many people drives a sense of hopelessness and despair. Why? Because their perception is now impacted, meaning they now focus their attention, the victim now focuses attention on this immediate predicament and can no longer think about the future. They can't dream. They can't hope. They can't think that there's more to life after this unfortunate situation. They begin to think that this temporary situation must in some sense be permanent. Thus, they now begin to experience feeling hopelessness, despair. Next, we say the act of being kidnapped creates a sense of humiliation and degradation. Humiliation and degradation, which also now has the adverse effect of making folks feel that if you are resistant, you will pay a price. If you are resistant, you will pay a price, which leaves persons feeling humiliated and degraded. Many slaves, African enslaved persons, would later tell the story of feeling ultimately humiliated when they would seek to run away to freedom. And unfortunately, now be caught by slave owners who would form the first police departments. Did you know the first police departments ever created were slave catchers, so to speak? That is the birth of police departments. Next, exhaustion. Exhaustion, being kidnapped or held in captivity causes a weakened mental and physical ability to resist being kidnapped and held in captivity. One also experiences threats. One also experiences threats. Now, the psychological trauma in kidnapping and captivity is also this idea that there'll be occasional indulgences that the perpetrator will provide to the victim from time to time, like positive motivation for compliance. Positive motivation for compliance. And so this is what creates now a system where particular persons who are enslaved will say, master treats us all right. This slavery thing ain't so bad after all. Because the perpetrator will intentionally give occasional indulgences. Last but not least, there's an idea that one will experience omnipotence on the part of the perpetrator of violence. Omnipotence. There's, in some sense, ways in which the perpetrator of violence will instill that they are omnipotent. They are all-knowing. They are all-powerful, and they are omnipresent. Who do we usually use those words to describe? These words of omnipotent, all-knowing, omnipresent. Who do we usually attribute these characteristics to? If you said God, you guessed it right. Yes. In some sense, perpetrators of violence, they now want to take on a God complex and basically inform or instill in their victim that they are omnipotent. They are God. They are superior and on the same level as the divine God. And finally, there will be a forcing of trivial demands. Forcing of trivial demands, where the victim basically will beg for their life. And as a result of begging for their life, unfortunately, they will learn that they have to be compliant. They have to be compliant. And so we say that these particular methods, isolation, monopolization of perception, humiliation and degradation, exhaustion, threats, occasional indulgences, demonstrating omnipotence, and forcing trivial demands are all part of methods that perpetrators of violence use to, in some sense, take away a person's hope and instill hopelessness and despair, and take away a victim's dignity. A question that we would have to reflect on today is, do we experience these types of dynamics occurring to us in particular environments? When have you experienced feeling isolated? When have you experienced a monopolization of your beliefs? When have you experienced humiliation, degradation, exhaustion, threats? We say, if you have experienced one of these unfortunate dynamics, you may suffer from trauma. You may suffer from trauma, and it is so important to seek help. It is so important to seek help. I feel so sad talking about this topic because, according to recent reports by our U.S. Census Bureau, at an all-time high in this country, and we're not raising any major concerns about it, is the kidnappings of Black girls and Black women today. There are so many kidnappings that occur, particularly of Black women. And we have remained silent or quiet about it in some sense. And so my heart goes out to victims of kidnapping and victims of oppression who are experiencing these methods being instituted by a perpetrator of violence today. Another question for us to reflect on is, what can we do to speak out against kidnappings and other forms of violence done to particular people, violence in particular that holds people captive? I'm reminded today of the large, heavy statistics around human and sex trafficking. Sex trafficking and human trafficking statistics are at an all-time high. And so what can we do to address this? What can we do to address this? Is one of the reflective questions for us today. I'll pause there.
We have, so to that omnipotent point, everybody said the Father, God. Also, Kathleen pointed out, yes, we do pretty much every day for one reason or another experience trauma. Trish points out that that affinity to the kidnapper, that term is called Stockholm Syndrome. Myra asked the question, would you say that kidnapping and being falsely incarcerated when innocent are similar in some aspects?
Oh, yes, yes, yes. I would say so. I would say so. That's why I'm a huge supporter of the Innocence Project. And I invite us to check out the Innocence Project. Yes, 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 my sister Myra. Thank you so much, my sister Trish, for pointing out Stockholm Syndrome. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, yes, yes.
And Trish says, if something doesn't look right, we ought to report it.
See something, say something.
Yeah, yeah.
See something, say something. We've lost that in our African American community. We've seemed to lose that. And that's deeply sad to me. I decided one day to go outside. And it was hot one day. And I was 12 years old. And I went outside. Oh, I'm sorry. Can I tell this story? You all promised to keep this story confidential. Nobody promises to tell this story to somebody, and don't post this story on Facebook now, okay?
Your secret is safe.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. I went outside. I was about 12 years old, and it was hot outside, about 90 degrees outside. And my mother and dad had left to go run some errands. And I was at home. With my grandma. And my grandma had this thing where she falls asleep during the day, watching her soap operas. General Hospital was her favorite. And following Luke and Laurie was her favorite characters. And I waited till she fell asleep on the couch, watching her soaps. And I decided to go outside. And it was hot, about 90 degrees that day. What did I do? I took off my shirt. And I'm standing outside with no shirt on, bare, 12 years old. And Miss Johnson, our next door neighbor, who was next door to my grandmother's house, came outside, she said, Daddy, you don't have no shirt on. I said, oh, forget you, Miss Johnson. Go on back in the house, old lady. And she says, go in the house right now. I'm going to call your grandma. I said, nope, she's asleep. And I had taken the phone off of the receiver and put it off to the side so nobody could call her house. That's old school. We had to take the receiver off. So if you call the number, you just get a busy signal. I said, nope, you can't call her, Miss Johnson. You can't get in. You can't get through the line. And she said, you didn't hear what I told you? I told you it's not appropriate for a young lady to be out here with no shirt on. Get back in the house. I said, nope, it's hot outside. And it feels so good to not have a shirt on, Miss Johnson. And next thing you know, when my mother got home, my mother gave me a spanking. And she explained, when Miss Johnson tells you to do something, you have to do it. I said, Miss Johnson's not even in our family. She's just an old lady that's bored and lives with cats and has no life. And she said, Miss Johnson is a part of our family. Miss Johnson is a part of the community. We seem to have lost that. What happens to community? Where has community gone? Where if you see something that's not right, you see a young person engaged in behaviors that's not appropriate, right? How come we don't jump in and say anything? Now, that also works twofold, because unfortunately, we've also lived during a time where people don't want you to say anything to their child, right? We've had some instances where parents have attacked teachers for bringing up concerns about how children have behaved. But we must keep trying. We must keep trying. It's so important for us to not grow weary. We must continue to remember that we are a community. And so in some sense, we say being held in captivity or being kidnapped creates chronic trauma. Chronic trauma. That image you see in green on your screen. Chronic trauma. A wonderful psychologist by the name of Judith Herman, in a cool book called Trauma and Recovery, talks about kidnapping and being held in captivity creates chronic trauma. That's this understanding where the trauma incident is repeated and prolonged. You know, other types of traumas that occur, they may occur in an instant and then be done. But chronic trauma is when someone is kidnapped. And so now the kidnapping occurs over the course of hours, days, months. And in the case of African persons, even 400 years. We also highlight in this conversation that there's such dynamic as acute trauma and complex trauma. Acute trauma is a regular single incident. A regular single incident. I shouldn't call it regular because trauma should not be considered regular. So I'm going to refrain from using the word regular. But acute trauma is a singular incident. A singular incident. And then a complex trauma is multiple traumatic events, overlapping or in succession. So what we've discovered oftentimes is trauma is not just one dynamic. Many of us suffer from complex trauma. Think about the story of Emmett Till again. Today, we're actually highlighting the fourth trauma he experienced. So one, he experiences the trauma of his father, unfortunately being killed. Then two, he experiences the trauma of living in poverty in Chicago. Three, he experiences the trauma of bystanders not intervening. And finally, he experiences the trauma of actually being kidnapped in the middle of the night. We would say in his young life, young Emmett Till experienced complex trauma, multiple traumatic events overlapping or in succession. So the question for us in these moments becomes, how can we be sensitive to people who are experiencing acute, chronic, and complex trauma? How can we be sensitive as people of faith to persons who are experiencing acute, chronic, and complex trauma? We say generally speaking that there is hope. There is hope. There is hope. There are ways in which we can support people who have experienced trauma. One way is by giving the person space, allowing time for the survivor to calm down and take perspective. Trauma survivors often have difficulty regulating emotions and can take longer to calm down. We also say recalibration is very important. Recalibration is very important. Recalibration is very important. Recalibration takes place through grounding techniques. Please write this down in your notes, family. Grounding techniques. We can help recalibrate people who have experienced trauma by helping them to experience a grounding technique. That's literally what it's called, a grounding technique. And one popular grounding technique that we use is called the 5-4-3-2-1 grounding technique. It's called the 5-4-3-2-1 grounding technique. The 5-4-3-2-1 grounding technique suggests, let's engage your 5 senses. Let's engage your 5 senses. What's our 5 senses? Our 5 senses are taste, touch, smell, hearing, sight, feeling. Let me give you an example of the grounding technique. The grounding technique says when somebody is experiencing some sort of trauma or has experienced some sort of trauma, it would be very helpful for them if you help them with a grounding technique by engaging all 5 of their senses. So let me give you an example specifically of that. You would ask the person, name me 5 things you can see right now. Name me 5 things you can see right now. As you look around your room or your home or the space that we're in, wherever we're at. We can even practice the grounding technique at church when someone experiences trauma. Give me 5 things you can see. That's what we would ask the person. And then we ask, give me 4 things you can feel. We literally ask them to show their hands and touch 4 things around them. 4 things around them. And then we ask them, give me 3 things you can hear. Give me 3 things you can hear. Or 3 things that you hear right in this moment. And last but not least, give me 2 things you could smell. 2 things you could smell. What does our current environment smell like? Last but not least, give me 1 thing you can taste. If you help someone practice this grounding technique using their 5 senses, it will immediately heal them, or not permanent healing, but it will give a temporary healing from the traumatic issue that they find themselves triggered by in this moment. And so what we often say is doing the grounding technique is a form of recalibration. We also say it's important to have predictability. No surprises. Well, a lot of people like surprises. People who have experienced trauma, like kidnapping, can't stand surprises. So if someone has been a victim of kidnapping and has been held captive before, you can't just call them up and say, hey, I'm on my way to come get you and I'm going to take you out for a surprise. That is very trauma-inducing to them. We also highlight the importance of giving perspective. Getting perspective. Be aware of when the past is intruding into the present. And don't take responsibility for what is not yours. Take perspective. Take perspective. Attribution. Attribution. This is a big one for us in the African American community. Oftentimes we will say, this person is simply acting like that because they're a product of their environment or they are a product of their upbringing. Or there's some other unrelated issue. That's why they are the way they are. And we have to say no. We have to call out the word trauma and attribute their responses to trauma. We have to be supportive, be kind, be loving, be patient, be empathic. Everybody is fighting a battle you know nothing about. So let us be kind in how we approach people and what we say to people, because you don't know the statement that you make to someone in these moments could be very harsh, and you don't know what they've been wrestling with. You don't know what they had to deal with before they interacted with you. Choice. Persons of trauma who've been kidnapped or held captive must be given the ability to make choices and be in control. They don't do well with being coerced or pushed to make a decision or forced to do something that they don't want to do. They have to be able to have options, to be able to have choices. And last but not least, reciprocity. Reciprocity, meaning you know what you like, you know what you want someone to provide for you. How do you give that to somebody else? We all want to be listened to. We all want our voice to be heard. So how do we do the work of listening to people? How do we do the work of giving voice to people? Hearing the beliefs, thoughts, and perceptions that people have. Reciprocity becomes so important. Do unto others as you would have them to do to you. What thoughts jump out in your mind as you see these particular helpful strategies? I feel sad sometimes because I wish our brother Emmett Till could have experienced some of these care strategies. Unfortunately, though, his life was taken. My hope in his story is that when his spirit went to heaven, the African ancestors and the God above, along with the Holy Spirit and Jesus, provided each one of these support systems and caring strategies for our brother. That is my hope. That is my sincere hope. I remember during the unfortunate killing of George Floyd, as he is taking his final breaths, we hear a moment on the videotape where he is literally calling for his mom, saying, "Mama, mama, mama." And in my imagination, I often wondered in those moments, was his mother, who was deceased and had went on before him, was she coming down to comfort her beloved baby who's experiencing this trauma at the hands of this racist white police officer? I'd like to think, to give us some sense of hope and not be too dreary with this topic, I like to think that even in the midst of brothers and sisters being traumatized and experiencing trauma that actually ends their earthly life, I like to hope that African ancestors and the God that we serve, the Holy Spirit, Jesus, comes down and provides these wonderful care strategies to our beloved brothers and sisters as they take their final breaths. I'll pause there
we had a couple of comments. Trish commented on that there's a thing, governmental kidnapping. Mike says our community unfortunately has oftentimes a no snitch mentality. And I also want to point out that trauma of kidnapping reverberates through the entire family. Emmett Till's mother certainly had to deal with a trauma. Joseph's father, Jacob, was traumatized, and from the Babylonian kidnapping, families were severely traumatized, and our African experience of being snatched from the continent and brought here certainly has had reverberations. You and I have talked about this before. The trauma has passed down, is epigenetic, and it has passed down even to us. And so we are traumatized because our ancestors who were snatched away, with that trauma is still with us. It plays out in many of our behaviors. And so, and one more, Trish said, this model seems like it would be a great strategy course of care for those suffering with mental illness. And I was thinking the same thing, panic attacks, that grounding technique, anxiety and panic attacks. That's, good thing to, for. So that's it.
Yes. Thank you. Yes. I want to encourage us as we reflect on this particular image. How do we be this for people who are hurting today? I count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I count 8 strategies altogether. How do we provide these 8 strategies for people who are hurting today? How do we provide these 8 strategies for people who are hurting today? That becomes another reflective question for us. Let's shift now and talk Bible for a second. Earlier, you had mentioned some Bible characters who were kidnapped. So we mentioned Joseph. And who was others that we had mentioned? Joseph was one.
The Israelites, the Hebrew, Daniel and the Hebrew boy, the Israelites taken into Babylon, and African people from the continent of Africa brought to these shores.
Thank you. As we look at Joseph and the Hebrew Israelites, I wonder in what ways did we see trauma playing out in their lives as a result of them being kidnapped? I wonder if we were to look at the story of Joseph in its entirety, or we were to look at the story of the Hebrew Israelites in its entirety, I wonder how the trauma of being kidnapped, held in captivity for a prolonged period of time. I wonder, in what way do you see trauma showing up in the rest of their lives because of this kidnapping? Joseph, what was Joseph's biggest wrestle? He is kidnapped. He is kidnapped now and forced to work in the home of, was it Potiphar?
Potiphar.
He is kidnapped, forced to work in the home of Potiphar. Now, what becomes his biggest struggle? Working in Potiphar's home.
Mrs.
Well, aside from Potiphar's wife. aside from having to deal with Potiphar's wife, who kept coming on to the brother and literally made that brother run out of his clothes one day.
Adjustment.
He had difficulty adjusting. He had difficulty believing in his self-identity as a dreamer. He always questioned his dreams that Holy Spirit, God would give to him. For the rest of his life, he now questions his identity. He questions, who am I? Because now, remember, we talked about earlier that when you're kidnapped, a perpetrator will also give you subtle indulgences every now and then. Potiphar even gives an indulgence to Joseph of elevating Joseph in his court to now be a leader in his court, which caused a disorienting dilemma for Joseph. Joseph now has a disorienting dilemma. He doesn't know who he is anymore. This becomes a trauma response. And so how do we re-examine many of our biblical characters' stories from the perspective of trauma?
Can I add this?
Yes, please,
that,
come on.
Joseph threw himself into his work to mitigate the hurt and pain of the trauma of kidnapping. So oftentimes we throw ourselves into work to try to mitigate the pain, to mitigate the disappointment. And in doing that, we only become more adjusted to something that is a maladjustment in the first place. And we get used to being maladjusted in a situation. And that happens with many of us going through whatever struggle, stress, trauma, throw ourselves into the work instead of being able to heal.
Yes. I'm reminded of stories that Harriet Tubman would later say when she was trying to galvanize people, African enslaved brothers and sisters, to go with her to the North. Many of them said, no, we good. We're fine. We don't want to leave. Everything is not that bad. Yes. Thank you so much. So then that brings another reflective question for us. Are we overworking in our life in response to the traumas that we wrestle with? Is overworking something that you find in Black community because we were kidnapped during the period of African enslavement? Right? That's a great question for us to think about, Pastor Jackson. Yes. So we want to, I'm sorry. Okay, so we want to encourage everybody. Please, take serious these strategies and interventions for caring for people. Please ask yourself, what is it that you could do to give back to the people who have experienced trauma by offering these wonderful supports? Please, we want to invite you to challenge yourself to offer grounding techniques when you encounter someone who is experiencing a trauma of some sort, or as Pastor Jackson and Trish said, like a panic attack, right? Please make these strategies a part of what you do, a part of your being, a part of what you can provide for people who are hurting today. Now, I'm going to invite you to study in advance for the last piece of our topic on this story of Emmett Till, and that's lynchings. Emmett Till is actually lynched. Emmett Till is actually lynched. And we say now that is, unfortunately, in his life, the last trauma he will experience. So he is kidnapped and then he is lynched. And we're going to talk about the ways in which lynchings are traumatic. Lynchings are traumatic. Lynchings cause trauma not only for the person, of course, who is the victim of the lynching, but lynchings also cause trauma for those who are forced to watch the lynchings, as was an occurrence in the days of African enslavement. And during the period of Jim Crow, lynchings were a public act, and that was intentional to cause trauma to the witnesses. And so we're going to spend some time highlighting that and talking about that. The term picnic has racial connotations because it comes from the period of African enslavement and Jim Crow in this country, where before a Black body was lynched, European slave masters would, and this also occurred during the period of Jim Crow, invite family and friends to come with food. And they would literally eat with food packed in baskets and mats and tablecloths to lay on the grass on the ground. And they would literally turn a lynching into a party, a celebration with food. And then after they finished eating, they would then enter into the process of lynching a body. And so it's important to think about and reflect on the trauma of that, because oftentimes they would also push the family of the person who was scheduled to be lynched. They would also force them to come to this event and partake in these festivities and just sit in terror, waiting for the unfortunate act to occur. That's why some people today refuse to use the word picnic, because the word picnic is synonymous with a phrase. I won't say the exact words here, but it was a short phrase for pick a and the N word. And so when people say today, oh, I'm going to a picnic, that word was used by European American persons to say, okay, yes, we're going to all gather in the park with food, with beverages, with drinks, with music. And after we finish partying, then we're going to lynch a Black person. And so that's a very traumatic experience for witnesses. So we're going to talk about that in relationship to Emmett Till and the ways in which his mom, Mamie Till Mobley, experienced much trauma when she was actually informed of the details of exactly what was done to his body. Some have compared the act of her having to be informed of what was actually done to his body as similar to when enslaved relatives had to watch their loved ones being lynched, and the details of seeing that and experiencing that in these moments. So one reflection for us is some people refuse to use the term picnic today. Some people decide to restrict that word from their vocabulary for that very reason, for the connotations of it.
Okay. Well, we've got our homework. And on that lynching piece, there's another great book that we kind of talked about. James Cone's book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree. So that's a part of our research. And thank you all for the comments. Trish, yes, we must be knowledgeable about these strategies in order to provide them to others. And maybe if you send me that, we can make some copies of those handouts that you had today.
Okay.
And thank you all for the comments. You're absolutely right, Myra. There's a loss of identity in the kidnapping, especially Joseph felt. Kathleen, you're right. We all are we're dealing with these traumas one way or another every day as people who are the ancestors of those who were taken from their homeland. It comes out one way or the other. And so it's good that we are mindful of it and we can be a little less harsh with one another, but also can build ways and institute ways that we can be more healing to each other. So thank you so much. Thank you, Doc.
Thank you.
Looking forward to next week, and y'all have a good day. I'll see many of you, hopefully all of you this evening.
Yes.
All right. Yeah.